Welcome to a world where secrets grow darker than the storm outside. Join Nero Wolfe and his sharp-witted assistant, Archie Goodwin, as they unravel a mystery buried beneath loyalty, betrayal, and a truth too dangerous to remain hidden. Where are you tuning in from today? And what time is it where you are right now? Settle in. The quiet dignity of a great detective faces the heavy cost of justice, and the truth waiting to be uncovered carries a weight even victory cannot easily lift. The rain clawed at the windows like a beggar at a feast, but inside the brownstone it was business as usual, warm, dry, and thoroughly resistant to anything resembling activity. Wolfe, entombed in his chair, was thumbing through a battered copy of the Iliad, presumably relishing each syllable like a morsel of trout mousse. I was at my desk, balancing our most recent case expenses against the check that hadn't yet materialized. Wolfe would have said something about my undue optimism if he'd glanced up, but he was ignoring me with expert precision. The doorbell's abrupt buzz was an affront to the peace he cherished. Wolfe's forehead creased by a millimeter. In his world, the equivalent of a primal scream. I dropped my pencil and headed for the door, wondering which lunatic thought it wise to venture out in this storm to annoy Nero Wolfe. Standing on the stoop, dripping like an abandoned umbrella, was a young woman who clutched her purse as if it might sprout legs and bolt. She looked as if she had rehearsed what to say and promptly forgotten all of it. I need to see Mr. Wolfe," she stammered, her voice pitching higher than necessary. I gave her the practiced smile I reserved for unsolicited visitors. "Unless you're carrying a murder weapon or a certified check, miss, you're better off calling first." Her eyes, wide and glassy, did what her words failed to accomplish. I opened the door wider. "Name?" I asked. "Veronica Lakewood." The name meant nothing to me, but the tremor in her voice did. I led her to the office, trailing Puddles, and announced her arrival with the solemnity of a man about to interrupt a religious ceremony. Wolfe didn't look up, but one eyebrow flickered, a seismic event in his private geography. Veronica perched on the edge of the red leather chair as if she expected it to spit her back out. Wolfe, having noted her anxiety, set his book down with the air of a martyr preparing for sacrifice. "You may speak," he said, as if dispensing a rare indulgence. "My great-aunt Clarissa Dunn," she began, voice catching, "passed away 3 weeks ago. They said it was an accident. She fell down the staircase at her home." "And you," Wolfe interjected dryly, "harbour doubts." She nodded, twisting the strap of her purse. "Aunt Clarissa wasn't clumsy. She hated those stairs. She always used the lift." I made a note, mentally. Motive, means, opportunity, the triumvirate Wolfe insisted governed all criminal enterprise, were all in play. "There's more," she said, leaning forward. "I think someone wanted her dead. And it wasn't just about her, it was about what she knew." Wolfe's fingers steepled beneath his chin. I could tell, though he would deny it later, that he was interested, despite himself. Veronica lowered her voice as though the rain itself might be eavesdropping. "My aunt kept a diary," she said, "not just daily thoughts or poetry. She wrote down everything, names, events, things people did, dangerous things." Wolfe allowed himself a slow blink, the equivalent of another man's gasp. "Why?" he asked. "Did she do that?" "She believed she owed it to the truth," Veronica faltered, "even if it hurt the people she cared about." I caught the subtle shift in Wolfe's posture, a fractional lean forward. "Shortly before she died," Veronica continued, "she told me the diary could ruin reputations. Powerful men, men with long memories and short tempers. And now," Wolfe said, voice like a drawbridge grinding open, "the diary is missing." Veronica nodded miserably. The room tightened perceptibly, like a string being drawn taut. I didn't need Wolfe's encyclopedic mind to tell me this was no ordinary sob story. Something dangerous had just seeped into our cozy brownstone. Veronica fumbled inside her purse, withdrawing a thin, battered slip of paper. She placed it gingerly on Wolfe's desk, as if handling an explosive device. It was a note, ink faded but legible, written in a spidery hand. "The truth shall fall if the diary is opened." Wolfe's nostrils flared, the equivalent of a lesser man leaping from his chair. "Found tucked in Aunt Clarissa's Bible," Veronica said, "after the funeral." I leaned in, squinting at the cryptic message. Wolfe didn't move. He sat staring at the note as if it had personally insulted his intelligence. Finally, with a grunt that might have signaled acquiescence or indigestion, he spoke. "Archie," he said, "fetch the brandy. And Miss Lakewood, kindly assume that I am listening. Begin at the beginning and omit nothing." The rain rattled against the glass with greater fury, as though applauding Wolfe's reluctant engagement. The case of Clarissa Dunn, the missing diary, and a death too convenient to be believed had just become our business. The Lakewood mansion squatted at the end of Hawthorne Lane like a relic that had overstayed its welcome. Age clung to it. In the heavy oak doors, the rain-streaked windows, the moss biting at the stone steps. Veronica hesitated before ascending, the faintest tremor in her hand as she reached for the tarnished knocker. Inside, the gloom had muscle. Dust lay over everything like a shroud hastily thrown aside, and the scent of lavender struggling against mildew filled the air. A grandfather clock somewhere in the house ticked laboriously, counting down to something best left unnamed. I didn't miss the details. The scuffed rug by the staircase, the faint scratch marks on the wall where someone's sleeve had brushed too hard. Subtle signs, but telling to a man in my trade. Veronica's voice, hushed and reverent, broke the silence. She loved this house. From where I stood, love didn't cover the sense of unease that seemed stitched into every corner. Someone had been here before us, and they hadn't come to pay their respects. I motioned her forward, already alert for the smallest thread that might unravel this neatly staged grief. Clarissa Dunn's study was a monument to orderly chaos, the kind only the truly meticulous achieve. Every book on the shelves wore a thin veil of dust, undisturbed. The mahogany desk gleamed from recent polish, yet the air felt wrong, as if something vital had been displaced and then clumsily disguised. I moved casually around the room, my hands clasped behind my back to lend the impression of respect, but my eyes missed nothing. A leather-bound set of encyclopedias showed slight misalignment. A framed photograph on the sideboard tilted half a degree to the right. The desk drawer, when tested, gave just a whisper of looseness at the catch, freshly tampered. Veronica stood near the hearth, arms wrapped tight across her chest. "She always kept her diary here," she said softly, nodding toward the desk. Whoever had searched this room had done so with a mind both careful and hurried, enough caution to avoid open signs of intrusion, enough desperation to risk leaving invisible fingerprints for the right observer. I made a mental note. Someone had wanted something badly, and hadn't quite gotten it. Philip Dunn entered the room with the casual entitlement of a man whose fortunes had always outweighed his character. Trim, polished, wearing grief like an ill-fitting tie, he offered Veronica a tight smile that had all the warmth of an empty safe. "Veronica," he said smoothly, "I didn't expect you back so soon." "I came for answers," she replied, the faint steel in her voice surprising even herself. Behind him trailed Harriet Dunn, her late husband's sister-in-law, a thin woman whose perpetual moist eyes suggested a professional mourner's resilience. She dabbed delicately at her lashes, casting glances that darted around the room like frightened birds. "We've all suffered a terrible loss," Harriet murmured, wringing a handkerchief already limp with use. Philip's gaze flickered over me, assessing, dismissing. I smiled pleasantly and said nothing. The undercurrent between them was palpable. Not grief, but a brittle politeness stretched too thin. Secrets don't always need words. Sometimes they thicken the very air. Clarissa's death had left more than mourning in her wake. It had disturbed balances, emotional, financial, and otherwise. I could feel it, humming faintly beneath the stale decorum like an electrical wire about to snap. Dr. Marcus Vance arrived under the pretense of offering condolences, though he wore the role with less conviction than a stagehand caught under the spotlight. A man of weary posture and cautious words, he shook Veronica's hand with exaggerated solemnity, then fixed his gaze somewhere slightly above her head, as if avoiding the truth stitched into her face. "We did everything we could," he said, voice as smooth and meaningless as water against stone. When pressed about Clarissa's final hours, Vance grew even vaguer, an impressive feat considering he had started from a position of obscurity. No remarkable symptoms, no warnings, just a tragic fall. It was during this stilted exchange that Clarissa's attorney produced the will. Routine in appearance, a few modest bequests, the bulk of her estate divided between Veronica and the Dunn heirs. Nothing dramatic, nothing scandalous, nothing, in fact, to warrant murder. Unless, of course, you knew something wasn't written down. Harriet's hands twisted the hem of her sleeve with increasing violence. Philip stood too still, the picture of a man rehearsing innocence. And Dr. Vance, if I was any judge, looked like a man who dearly wished to be elsewhere. I wasn't buying any of it. After the formalities had been exhausted and the guests began dispersing like weary mourners from a funeral they'd staged themselves, I took a slow wander through the hall, letting instinct tug me along. Harriet's voice, thin as fishing wire, slipped around a corner. "It must stay buried," she whispered, urgency sharpening her tone. I froze, the words pricking my skin colder than the rain outside. The recipient of her warning, a maid? "Philip?" murmured a reply too low for me to catch. I eased closer, but the conversation dissolved into footsteps retreating toward the kitchen, where clinking teacups would serve as plausible camouflage. Stay buried, I thought. That wasn't mourning, that was strategy. Whatever Clarissa had kept, and whatever she had threatened to unleash, was now a live grenade someone was desperate to keep smothered. I rejoined Veronica with a neutral expression, filing the overheard fragment away with the precision Wolfe would demand. A careless whisper often said more than a dozen polished lies. And this one hinted we hadn't yet begun to dig deep enough. As we drove away from the mansion's oppressive bulk, Veronica sat silently beside me, twisting the strap of her handbag the way Harriet had twisted her sleeves, a mirror of private despair. "She warned me once," Veronica said suddenly, voice brittle. "Said the truth she held could topple men if she ever set it free." I kept my hands steady on the wheel, letting her speak. "She said it wasn't just scandal," she whispered. "It was something more, something dangerous, hidden in ink. Hidden in ink, and now missing." It wasn't hard to connect the dots. Someone had known about the diary. Someone who feared it, or what it could reveal, enough to kill. The rain battered the windshield with frantic fingers, blurring the world outside into grey smudges. Inside the car, the air was tighter, heavier. Veronica's guilt was a living thing, pressing against her ribs, and somewhere back at that rotting mansion, secrets were gnashing their teeth in the dark, waiting to be unearthed. I kept my foot steady on the accelerator, feeling the slow but steady pull of inevitability. Whatever Clarissa Dunn had written, it hadn't died with her. It had only begun to matter. The call came in just after lunch, when Wolfe was deep in battle with a portion of sautéed calf's liver, and I was contemplating how much damage the rain had done to my shoes. Inspector Kramer's voice growled over the telephone like a dog with a bone too big to chew. "Marcus Vance, dead, found slumped in his Packard outside the medical building. Looks like a heart attack." "Thought you might want to know, Wolfe, considering your latest tangle." Wolfe, still chewing, didn't rise to the bait. He waved a lazy hand at me, his version of a command. "Details," he murmured around the liver. I relayed what little Kramer had offered, Vance, dead behind the wheel, no signs of violence, no obvious foul play, if you bought the surface story. Wolfe's eyes narrowed, and for a moment the gluttony retreated, replaced by a colder appetite. "Coincidences," he said, wiping his lips meticulously, "are the refuge of simpletons. I am not one." He set down his fork. "Archie, we shall not insult our intelligence. You will arrange for an autopsy, at once." Autopsies aren't usually my idea of an afternoon well spent, but when Wolfe growls, I fetch. A few calls to the right corners of the medical examiner's office, a little leaning, and the machinery of official skepticism groaned into motion. The result came through faster than I'd expected. Poison. A tidy little dose of digitalis, masked just enough to mimic the heart giving out on a rainy Tuesday. Wolfe received the report with a grunt that might have been satisfaction. "Predictable," he said. "The hand that concealed Clarissa Dunn's truths has now silenced her physician. It is a continuity most inelegant." "Sloppy too," I offered, noting Wolfe's frown deepen. He tapped the polished wood of his chair arm with 2 fingers, a soft staccato of displeasure. "Sloppy or desperate, it makes little difference. It clarifies the essential point. Someone is willing to kill repeatedly to bury a secret inadequately hidden." He rose, a rare and momentous event, and stalked to the globe, spinning it absently with one hand. "The enemy," he said, "grows careless. We must be quick before the next corpse clutters the field." And just like that, the game had changed. Again, Saul Panzer had talents that would make a saint nervous. 24 hours later, he dropped a slim file on Wolfe's desk and stood back like a chef awaiting praise. "It seemed, Doctor." Vance had been growing increasingly agitated in the days leading to his death, not about a patient, about an object. A set of papers reportedly kept in Clarissa Dunn's wall, safe papers he had attempted to retrieve the night she died. Problem was, someone else had beaten him to it, or worse, someone had intercepted him during his search. I spent the next afternoon making polite nuisances of myself at Clarissa's mansion. A few innocent questions here, a few ill-timed door openings there, and it didn't take long to confirm that yes, Clarissa had indeed maintained a safe behind a portrait in her study. Now empty, now irrelevant, or so someone hoped. Veronica's face, when I told her, crumpled with something more profound than sadness. It was betrayal, old and fresh at once. The secret Clarissa had guarded had slipped through her fingers, and ours, without leaving so much as a footprint. Unless we found who had it, and why they were willing to kill for it, the next move would be theirs, not ours. Returning to the mansion under the guise of verifying estate inventories gave me a front-row seat to a spectacle Wolfe would have called psychological fraying under duress. Philip Dunn prowled the hallways like a restless wolf, snapping at servants, barking orders no one seemed eager to obey. His nerves were showing through the polish. Harriet clung to propriety like a drowning woman to a plank, her weepy eyes scanning every passerby as if expecting a dagger from the nearest handmaid. Even the house staff, usually masters of the professional blank stare, betrayed whispers behind closed doors and startled glances at shadows. Fear, once a distant drumbeat, was now pounding inside these walls. I didn't need Wolfe's deductive prowess to know why. Dr. Vance's death hadn't merely rattled them. It had driven a wedge between allies of convenience. When murder stalks familiar corridors, every creak of a floorboard starts sounding like an indictment. One thing was clear, whoever had Clarissa's secret was losing grip on their own alibi. And when that last, thin thread snapped, Wolfe intended to be standing in the center, ready to tighten the noose. It was Veronica who tipped me off to Harriet's restless habits. "She doesn't sleep much," she said quietly. "Walks the halls at night, talks to herself." A little midnight vigilance confirmed it. At precisely 2:30 in the morning, Harriet emerged from her room, slippered feet ghosting down the corridor. No light. No sound but the soft scuff of worn carpet under cautious steps. I shadowed her down the hallways as she drifted toward the study, Clarissa's sanctum, and watched from the shadows as she knelt before the fireplace. Her fingers skimmed the hearthstones, seeking, prodding, desperate. A minute later, she rose, empty-handed, and fled back upstairs with the silent terror of someone who had seen a ghost but dared not speak its name. Back at my corner, I grinned without humor. Harriet wasn't just sentimental about the past, she was hunting it or trying to erase it. Either way, Wolfe would find her extremely interesting. Very soon. I found the envelope tucked under the windshield wiper of my car the next morning, its plainness more chilling than any blood-red lettering would have been. Inside, one sheet of paper, hand-typed. Drop the diary or share Clarissa's fate. No signature, no flair, just pure, stripped-down threat. I showed it to Wolfe, who read it once, made a small sound of disgust, and dropped it onto his desk as though it were contagious. "Amateurs," he said. "A professional would have killed you without the courtesy of a warning." "Touching," I said. "I feel all warm inside." Wolfe's eyes gleamed briefly, the only sign of the excitement he refused to confess. "This confirms urgency," he said. "Our adversary is increasingly reckless." "And nervous?" I added. "Nerves make mistakes." He inclined his head in agreement, the barest tilt. "We shall assist them," he said, "by applying pressure, judiciously but firmly." I didn't ask how, I didn't need to. The brownstone was no longer a sanctuary, it was a fortress preparing for siege, and somewhere beyond its walls a murderer was realizing that burying the past might just cost them everything. Wolfe disliked disorder almost as much as he despised unnecessary effort. When circumstances demanded exertion, he preferred delegation executed with surgical precision. Seated behind his desk, he orchestrated the plan with the gravity of a general, dispatching his finest officers into hostile territory. "Archie, Saul, and Durkin," he said, voice clipped and formal. "3 fronts, 3 opportunities to uncover the truth Clarissa Dunn left behind." Saul received his orders first, Clarissa's affiliations, particularly any frictions with organizations or institutions invested in discretion. Fred Durkin's task was more earthbound: locate the handyman rumored to have assisted Clarissa in recent months. Men like that had a tendency to see what polite society preferred to ignore. As for me, I was to piece together the connections Clarissa's enemies hoped to keep shredded, starting with her nearest surviving relatives and the city's more perfumed corridors of influence. Wolfe leaned back, his fingers steepled in thought. "Time," he said softly, "is our true adversary. Proceed with celerity and discretion." The storm outside had less fury than the one Wolfe had now set into motion, and as I pulled on my coat, I knew that for some of us, discretion would soon be in very short supply. Saul Panzer had a way of extracting secrets from stone walls and steel doors. Within 24 hours, he returned to the brownstone, his jacket damp from the lingering rain, a thin folder tucked beneath his arm. "Clarissa Dunn," he reported, "wasn't the quiet old dame her social calendar suggested." Wolfe's eyes brightened with intellectual appetite. Saul laid it out crisply. 5 years earlier, Clarissa had tried, and nearly succeeded, in exposing a financial scandal within a prestigious charity board, a charity ostensibly devoted to aiding war orphans, but in reality a cash cow milked by its own board members. Clarissa had been the lone dissenting voice, silenced by veiled threats and ultimately blackballed socially. She hadn't gone public, perhaps to shield Veronica, perhaps out of misplaced loyalty, but she had not forgotten, and she had not forgiven. The charity's leadership, Saul added, included none other than Philip Dunn and a councilman named Walter Niven. Wolfe tapped a finger against the armrest, each beat echoing heavier. "Past sins," he said, "are poor fertilizer. Yet how prodigiously they bear fruit. We had motive now and roots deep enough to tangle anyone foolish enough to disturb them." Fred Durkin's talents were less subtle but no less effective. By the end of the second day, he shuffled into the office, shedding his raincoat and glancing around as if expecting Wolfe to demand an oath before he spoke. Found him, Fred said. Name's Mort Paddock, used to fix locks, safes, odd stuff for Miss Clarissa. Lived in a rat trap near Delancey, moved 2 months before she died. Wolfe motioned him on with a finger. Paddock hadn't seen the diary. At least, he claimed he hadn't. But he did remember installing a concealed panel in the garden conservatory hidden under a marble planter. Miss Clarissa, he said, had been mighty particular about that project, overseeing every stone's placement herself. She told me, Paddock had added, some things grow better in the dark. Fred delivered the line with a grimace that mirrored my own. The implication was clear enough. Clarissa had hidden something she knew she couldn't protect openly. Not in a safe, not in a study. Wolfe's expression remained unreadable, but there was a sharper tension to his posture now. The game Clarissa had begun years ago had not ended with her death. If anything, it had only sharpened its teeth. Tracking Philip Dunn's associates didn't require a bloodhound's nose. His name clung to real estate deals, civic projects, and social functions like a burr in velvet. And wherever Dunn's name appeared, Walter Niven's wasn't far behind. Niven, councilman, philanthropist, and, according to half the barkeeps and doormen I spoke to, a man who liked his secrets buried deeper than a pauper's grave. It wasn't hard to piece together. Both men had sat on the charity board Clarissa once tried to expose. Both had reason to silence anyone capable of dragging their old sins into the light. What gnawed at me was the timeline. Clarissa's death hadn't triggered panic. Dr. Vance's murder had. Someone hadn't just wanted Clarissa silenced. They'd needed her records annihilated. And if Clarissa had shared even a scrap of what she knew before her death, even hinted at it, then whoever held the diary now wasn't merely covering past sins. They were fighting to keep the present from collapsing. Wolfe would say that fear is the one emotion even liars cannot suppress. And judging by what I was seeing, fear was beginning to bloom like mold in a flooded cellar. The final nail came courtesy of Saul Panzer, who appeared at Wolfe's door with the air of a man delivering a loaded gun. He dropped a sheaf of copied letters onto Wolfe's desk, dated only a month before Clarissa's death. Handwritten, terse, unmistakable. Clarissa had issued formal warnings to both Dunn and Niven, threatening public exposure if restitution to the charity wasn't forthcoming. The letters weren't bluster, they were a declaration of war. Wolfe read them silently, his lips compressed into a line that suggested no pleasure in being proven right. Idiocy, he muttered. Predictable, pedestrian idiocy. Clarissa had tried to grant her adversaries a final mercy, a chance to correct their crimes without scandal. They had answered her offer with murder. Saul added, almost apologetically, that there were rumors Clarissa had spoken of making one last copy of her evidence. For safekeeping, Wolfe's gaze sharpened. If the diary existed, if Clarissa's final weapon remained hidden, then the board's surviving parasites would stop at nothing to find it first, or kill again, trying. And that meant our timeline had shrunk, measured not in days, but in heartbeats. The weight of it all came crashing down on Veronica like a structure too long undermined by rot. She sat rigid in the office's guest chair, pale hands clenching the hem of her skirt, as Wolfe summarized what we had learned. Her voice, when it came, was thick with remorse. "She warned me," Veronica whispered. I thought it was just paranoia." Wolfe regarded her with a gaze neither gentle nor cruel, merely precise. "Grief encourages self-indulgence," he said. "Guilt encourages folly. Neither will assist us now." I winced inwardly. Wolfe was about as soothing as a sandpaper handshake, but Veronica only nodded, absorbing the rebuke like a woman determined not to fold again. Wolfe folded his hands together atop his stomach, his expression grave. "There will be another death," he said simply, "unless we uncover the diary before our adversaries do." The rain lashed harder against the windows as if affirming his grim prophecy. Veronica straightened her shoulders, her guilt hardening into resolve. For Clarissa, for the truth. and as Wolfe closed his eyes, deep in thought, I knew the brownstone was no longer merely a safe harbour. It had become the last fortress against a storm that was still gathering strength. Wolfe's orders were clear, and I wasn't about to improvise with a man who measured deviation from his instructions as a mortal sin. At the mansion, I manufactured a casual visit under the pretense of finalizing estate inventories. When the opportunity arose, and with Harriet hovering nearby like a moth too close to the flame, I let slip a morsel carefully prepared to catch her interest. I turned up an old notebook behind the desk, I said offhandedly. Might be nothing. Personal stuff, maybe. Her reaction was gratifyingly immediate. A visible stiffening, a twitch at the corner of her mouth, a quick dart of the eyes to verify no one else had heard. "Oh," she said, too quickly. "That's curious." I tucked the non-existent notebook back into my satchel with deliberate slowness, watching her chew her lower lip like it owed her money. Patience was vital. The trap had been laid, and if Wolfe was correct, and he usually was, however insufferably, the scent of her own fear would lead Harriet straight to the confession we needed. The only question now was whether she'd nibble politely or lunge with both hands. It didn't take long. Later that evening, as the household settled into uneasy silence, Harriet cornered me in the side corridor leading to the kitchen. Her face was pale and slick with nerves, her hands clutching a satin purse like it might sprout fangs. I need to speak to you, Mr. Goodwin," she whispered, her voice wobbling under the strain. I allowed a nod, feigning casual disinterest. She leaned closer, her breath faintly sour with fear. "The notebook. May I see it?" I smiled blandly. "Not standard operating procedure, Mrs. Dunn, but you can tell me why it interests you." She fumbled with the purse and extracted a thick envelope. Cash, by the look and smell of it. "Please," she said, thrusting it at me. "Forget you ever found it. It's private, personal. It would hurt no one but the living." I made a show of considering, while inside I tallied another point on Wolfe's ever-lengthening ledger of human folly. The desperation leaking from her pores wasn't about sentiment, it was about survival, and survival always left fingerprints. Under Wolfe's instructions, I declined the envelope, politely, for now, and pressed harder. Harriet's defenses crumbled like wet paper. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," she said, her hands wringing themselves into knots. "Clarissa asked me to destroy some of her letters, private matters from years ago, things she didn't want, paraded after her death." "What kind of things?" I asked, letting a trace of skepticism sharpen my tone. She flinched. "Old arguments, scandals, misunderstandings long buried." I kept my face neutral, though inwardly I filed away the trembling in her voice. Half-truths had a distinct flavour, and Harriet was serving them up by the platter. She insisted she had obeyed Clarissa's wishes, feeding stacks of correspondence into the fireplace one rainy evening, never asking questions, never reading. But the damage had been done. Harriet had blood on her hands. Metaphorical, perhaps, but in Wolfe's calculations, motive and opportunity didn't require literal stains. Still, one crucial point remained untouched, and I intended to strike it next. Had Harriet truly destroyed everything? Or had something slipped through the flames, surviving like a spark beneath the ashes? When pressed further, Harriet's explanations became more ragged, her words tangling around themselves. "The diary," she whispered at last, as if confessing to sacrilege. "I assumed it was nothing criminal. Family gossip, embarrassing but harmless." "That's an expensive assumption," I said, watching her shrink inward. She shook her head vehemently. "Clarissa was proud, private. She wouldn't want our name dragged through the mud. I thought, if it were only indiscretions, foolishness, better to keep it quiet." I let the silence spool out, watching guilt carve deeper into the lines of her face. Harriet hadn't known the true weight of the diary, but her instincts had screamed danger anyway. And instincts, Wolfe often said, were merely facts not yet consciously processed. Harriet had burned letters, plotted distractions, and peddled bribes not because of what she knew, but because of what she feared she might learn. Unfortunately for her, ignorance had never been a good defense. And now, too late, she realized she had not just hidden family sins, she had helped bury a truth that others were still willing to kill for. When Veronica learned of Harriet's confession, the dam of strained civility between them burst. "You destroyed her words," Veronica said, voice trembling with fury. "You betrayed her trust." Harriet cowered in her chair, the tears she summoned no longer evoking sympathy. The room crackled with betrayal so thick you could taste it. "I thought it was for the best," Harriet protested weakly. "The best for whom?" Veronica demanded. "For Aunt Clarissa? Or for you?" Wolfe, from his seat, observed the exchange with clinical detachment, as if mentally cataloguing the emotional wreckage for later use. I leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, feeling the cold weight of inevitability settle into my gut. Whatever bond had once existed between these women had been shredded beyond repair. Even if the diary were found, even if justice was served, the cost would not be paid merely in reputation. It would be paid in blood ties severed forever. And in Wolfe's world, broken trust was often the final crime, the one no punishment could ever amend. It was in the aftermath of the confrontation that Harriet, wringing her hands to ribbons, gasped out the final clue. "There was something else," she whispered. "Clarissa loved her garden. She said it would keep her secrets safe." I straightened. Wolfe, without moving a muscle, seemed to radiate a new and sharper focus. "Where in the garden?" I asked. Harriet shook her head miserably. "She didn't say, only that her orchids would bloom over the truth." Wolfe's voice, when it came, was soft but lethal. "You will direct Mr. Goodwin immediately to the conservatory." 15 minutes later, flashlight in hand, I crouched among the dense foliage of Clarissa's beloved plants. The marble planter in the far corner looked innocent enough until closer inspection revealed scratches near its base, faint but deliberate. I pried it carefully aside. Beneath it, embedded in the soil, was a shallow depression lined with stone. Empty, but promising. Whatever had been hidden here had either been removed recently, or was still waiting, buried deeper. Either way, the garden had begun to whisper, and I was ready to listen. The marble planter yielded reluctantly, scraping against the stone floor with a sound that set my teeth on edge. Beneath it, nestled in a hollow lined with oilcloth, was a leather-bound book, cracked at the edges but otherwise miraculously intact. I brushed the soil off carefully. Clarissa's initials, tooled faintly into the cover, stared up at me like a challenge issued from beyond the grave. Back at the brownstone, I presented it to Wolfe without ceremony. He examined it with the reverence usually reserved for first editions or rare orchids. Then, with a surgeon's precision, he opened the cover. A moment of silence fell over the office as he skimmed the first few pages. I could see the tension gather at the corners of his mouth like storm clouds. When Wolfe tightened up, it was never from sentiment. It was a barometer of the storm brewing just behind his polished forehead. "Archie," he said finally, voice low, "prepare yourself for an exhibition of human folly writ large." I didn't ask. I merely pulled up a chair and settled in, ready to read the true story Clarissa Dunn had fought, and ultimately died, to protect. The diary was no idle ramble of a lonely old woman. It was a ledger of betrayal. Clarissa had recorded with meticulous precision the embezzlement orchestrated by the charity's board, trusted men siphoning funds meant for orphans, padding their own accounts while posing as pillars of the community. Philip Dunn's name appeared early and often alongside Walter Niven's. Falsified invoices, phantom construction projects, invented beneficiaries. The rot ran deep, and Clarissa had traced every thread with an accountant's ruthlessness and a moralist's outrage. Wolfe read in silence, turning pages with a fingertip. Occasionally a sardonic grunt punctuated the air, his only concession to the disgust he must have felt. For my part, the facts peeled back like layers of diseased skin. These weren't minor infractions, they were crimes written in ledgers and cancelled checks, crimes that fattened bank accounts while children went without meals and medicines. Clarissa hadn't stumbled onto this lightly. She had seen the cost, and despite the odds, refused to look away. It wasn't just theft, it was betrayal of the most brutal kind, betrayal cloaked in respectability, in charity balls and public speeches, smiling all the while. Near the middle of the diary, the entries shifted tone, from righteous indignation to quiet horror. Clarissa had unearthed more than financial fraud. She discovered that 2 years earlier, a fire had gutted one of the orphanages under the charity's care. Officially, it had been labelled an accident, faulty wiring, tragic but unavoidable. Unofficially, Clarissa learned the truth. The wiring had been condemned months before, repairs had been budgeted, and the funds stolen. 2 children had died because Philip Dunn and Walter Niven considered their profit margins more important than human lives. The diary detailed the attempts to bury the evidence, paid off inspectors, falsified reports, threats issued to any who dared raise questions. Wolfe's face remained impassive, but I could feel the fury coiling beneath the surface like a snake too tightly wound. Clarissa had seen the cost of silence. She had realized that exposing theft was one thing, but exposing blood-soaked negligence was another. She had threatened them, and they had answered her with death, not in the bright light of accusation, but with a shove down a staircase in the privacy of her own home. Justice, Clarissa had understood, was never given freely. It had to be seized. Piecing together the entries, Wolfe and I constructed the grim timeline. Clarissa hadn't acted rashly. She had issued private warnings first, offering Dunn and Niven a chance to repay the stolen funds, to atone quietly. Perhaps she had believed, or desperately hoped, that they would seize the opportunity to do right. They hadn't. Instead, they had accelerated their efforts to silence her. Surveillance, intimidation. And when that failed, something far more permanent. Wolfe tapped a page gently. Her fatal error, he said, was mercy. A foolish belief in the capacity for repentance. I nodded grimly. Clarissa had underestimated the lengths desperation could drive men to. In threatening exposure, she hadn't merely endangered reputations, she had threatened the very fabric of power these men had woven around themselves. Her death had been neither impulsive nor emotional. It had been cold arithmetic, the price of survival for those who had long ago mortgaged their souls. And now, as Wolfe closed the diary and set it reverently on his desk, the weight of that unburied truth hung between us, thick and heavy as storm clouds. Clarissa had begun a war she hadn't lived to finish. It was left to us to end it. When Veronica arrived at the brownstone, summoned by a terse call from me, her eyes were already rimmed red, as if she sensed the magnitude of what awaited her. Wolfe, sparing no delicacy, presented the diary without preamble. As she read, her hands trembled, then stilled, then tightened around the leather binding with the fierce protectiveness of someone cradling a wounded animal. "I should have listened," she said hoarsely. "I should have believed her." "No," Wolfe corrected gently. "A rarity. You should have understood her. There is a difference." Veronica pressed the diary to her chest, as if hoping to absorb its truths through her skin. Guilt etched itself into every line of her posture, but beneath it, something harder took root: determination. Clarissa had not died in vain. Veronica would see to that. In her, the weight of legacy shifted, not a burden of shame, but a duty, to see Clarissa's sacrifice honored, to ensure that the rot was dragged into the merciless light of public scrutiny. Watching her, I knew Wolfe saw it too. Redemption was a bitter coin, bought dearly, but sometimes it still bought something worth having. Wolfe spent the better part of an hour in contemplative silence, a glass of beer untouched at his elbow, the diary resting like a sacred relic before him. Finally he spoke. "We possess the truth," he said. but truth alone is inert. Action animates it. I waited, knowing better than to interrupt, when Wolfe's mind was charting paths through the moral labyrinth. Exposure will shatter reputations, he mused. It will ruin lives beyond those directly culpable. Innocents always suffer in the wake of justice. Still worth it? I asked quietly. Wolfe's gaze met mine, cool and implacable. Always. He stood, a rare occurrence outside of dining hours, and tapped the diary once, lightly. Tonight, he said, we summon the players. We strip them bare of pretense. We restore, however inadequately, the balance Clarissa Dunn sought. I rose, feeling the same grim energy tighten my spine. The time for subtlety had passed, the time for confrontation had arrived, and in Wolfe's hands the truth would be neither shield nor prayer. It would be a blade. The air inside the brownstone that evening carried the charged stillness of a courtroom before the verdict. Wolfe had arranged the chairs himself, a rare concession to symbolism, positioning them with the strategic elegance of a chess master preparing the endgame. Veronica sat closest to Wolfe's desk, pale but composed. Harriet, fluttering a damp handkerchief, perched uneasily beside her. Philip Dunn took a seat with the stiff-necked arrogance of a man accustomed to controlling outcomes, while Walter Niven settled heavily into his chair, his mouth drawn into a bitter line. Each had come at Wolfe's summons, unwilling but unable to refuse, driven by a mixture of curiosity, fear, and the silent calculation that accompanies guilty consciences. I took my place by the door, arms folded, ready for whatever storm Wolfe intended to unleash. For a long moment, Wolfe said nothing, allowing the tension to ferment and thicken. His gaze moved slowly from one face to the next, weighing, judging, recording. Outside, the rain hammered at the windows, but inside, the true tempest was yet to break. When Wolfe finally spoke, it was with the calm, precise diction of a surgeon describing an unavoidable amputation. The game was about to end, and Wolfe, as ever, would dictate the terms. Wolfe cleared his throat, a low rumble of authority that drew every eye. "You are here," he began, "because you are all, to varying degrees, entangled in the death of Clarissa Dunn." Philip shifted in his chair, a flicker of disdain crossing his features. Walter merely folded his arms, a practiced display of indifference. Harriet dabbed at her temples, trembling. "You will, no doubt," Wolfe continued, "protest your innocence, spare yourself the effort. The facts, though cloaked in subterfuge and cowardice, are immutable." He paused, letting the words sink their teeth in. "It is a matter of public record that Miss Dunn served on the board of a charitable organization. It is a matter of private record, soon to become otherwise, that certain board members misappropriated funds." Philip opened his mouth, thought better of it, and snapped it shut. "Clarissa Dunn," Wolfe said softly, "intended to expose this betrayal. She offered mercy. She received death." The fire had not yet erupted. Wolfe was merely building the scaffolding, brick by relentless brick. Each word was a hammer blow, driving home the inevitability of collapse. Only fools would continue to cling to the wreckage. And as Wolfe's heavy-lidded gaze swept over the assembled faces, it was evident that fools were precisely what he expected to find. Wolfe leaned back slightly, steepling his fingers. "Philip Dunn," he said with cold precision, "stood to lose not only his fortune, but his standing. Walter Niven, whose political ambitions depended on unsullied public perception, faced ruin." Philip's jaw tightened. Walter stared at a spot on the rug, unwilling to meet anyone's eye. "Clarissa Dunn's diary," Wolfe continued, "contained more than accusations. It contained evidence, bank records, letters, transactions so damning that even the most skilled legal defense would founder." I watched the tension ratchet tighter with every syllable. "You could not steal the diary without suspicion," Wolfe said. "You could not discredit Clarissa without risk, so you silenced her." "No," Harriet gasped, half rising from her chair. "They—" "Sit down," Wolfe commanded. his voice slicing through the room like a blade. Harriet collapsed back into her seat, weeping softly. "You involved Dr. Marcus Vance," Wolfe said, his tone even colder now. "An unwilling accomplice. When he threatened to expose your scheme, or perhaps simply faltered, you eliminated him as well." Philip lunged to his feet, color high in his cheeks. "You can't prove—" "I do not require proof in this room," Wolfe said, unperturbed. "Proof is for the police. Here, I require only clarity." And clarity, brutal and uncompromising, was exactly what he delivered. "Dr. Vance," Wolfe said, ignoring Philip's outburst, "sought the diary after Clarissa's death, under pressure you both exerted." He turned his gaze fully on Walter Niven, whose composure had begun to crack, beads of sweat blooming along his hairline. "Vance retrieved nothing," Wolfe said. "Clarissa had anticipated your treachery. The diary remained hidden." Walter muttered something unintelligible, shifting in his seat like a man realizing the floorboards were on fire. "When you realized Vance could not deliver," Wolfe continued inexorably, "you resorted to more direct measures." Walter blurted, "He was unstable. He... Wolfe lifted a hand, silencing him. "Spare me the rationalizations. You poisoned a man to protect yourselves. You would have done worse if required." The room seemed to shrink under the weight of the accusation. "Clarissa's death was not an isolated act," Wolfe said. "It was part of a conspiracy driven by fear and sustained by cowardice." Veronica, silent until now, pressed her hand over her mouth, her eyes burning with a fury she could no longer contain. "And like all conspiracies," Wolfe concluded, "yours was doomed from inception." There was no triumph in his voice, only the heavy finality of a man pronouncing a sentence long overdue. The true execution, though, was still to come. Wolfe nodded once to me. I stepped forward and placed the diary, battered, undeniable, onto the desk with a small but deliberate thud. Philip recoiled slightly as if it might bite. Walter leaned forward involuntarily, eyes locked on the leather cover like a man watching his own noose being tied. "You may, if you wish," Wolfe said, almost conversationally, "deny your involvement. You may even continue the farce of innocence." He tapped the diary lightly. "But it will avail you nothing." Philip's mouth twisted. "You have no right—" "I have every right," Wolfe interrupted. "Clarissa Dunn entrusted her truth to these pages. You entrusted your freedom to your own ineptitude." He opened the diary to a bookmarked page, reading aloud in Clarissa's meticulous hand. Details of diverted funds, bribed inspectors, falsified reports. Every word drove another nail into the coffin they had so carefully constructed. Walter slumped forward, his head in his hands. Philip remained rigid, his eyes glittering with the hopeless fury of a man who sees the walls closing in and finds no door. "There is no refuge," Wolfe said softly, "only the inevitable reckoning." And outside, the faint wail of sirens rose, growing louder, drawing closer. The reckoning had come. The police arrived with admirable efficiency. Kramer himself led the charge, his face as grim as a funeral procession. Philip and Walter were escorted out without ceremony, their protests drowned by the shuffling of feet and the creak of polished leather cuffs. When the door finally closed behind them, silence fell, heavy, absolute. Veronica sat frozen for a moment, then rose unsteadily. She approached Wolfe's desk and laid her hand gently atop the diary. "She fought alone," she said, her voice cracking. "And still, she fought." Wolfe inclined his head, a gesture of respect he rarely bestowed. "You honor her," he said simply. Tears slid silently down Veronica's cheeks, but she made no move to wipe them away. They were not tears of defeat, nor even sorrow. They were the tears of someone who understood, finally, fully, the price of loyalty paid in full measure. She lifted the diary, cradling it like a sacred trust, and turned away. For Clarissa Dunn there would be no applause, no public vindication, only the quiet, stubborn survival of truth. And sometimes, Wolfe had once said, That was the only kind of victory worth having. Kramer, before leaving, turned back briefly. "You're lucky they didn't gut you too," he muttered to Wolfe. Wolfe offered a faint, wintry smile. "Luck," he said, "is a euphemism for preparation met with opportunity." When the brownstone was finally ours again, Wolfe leaned back, folding his hands across his stomach. "Archie," he said, "what is the greater betrayal? The betrayal born of fear, or the one born of ambition?" I shrugged. "Depends on who's writing the obituary." He gave a short, dry laugh, one with no real amusement behind it. Outside, the rain had stopped at last, but the brownstone remained wrapped in the heavy stillness that follows any great upheaval. Inside, the echoes of betrayal lingered, not loud, but stubborn, refusing to be wiped away with a signature or a sentence. Later that evening, Wolfe retreated to his chair with a glass of beer, untouched. He sat in silence for a long time, his gaze unfocused, as if peering not at the room around him, but through it, into some darker ledger that no hand could ever fully balance. "Greed," he said finally, almost to himself, "is the most persistent of human hungers. It consumes memory, it devours loyalty, it leaves only bones." I said nothing. There wasn't much to add. Clarissa Dunn had died trying to stem that hunger. Veronica would live trying to honor it. And Wolfe, who claimed disdain for sentiment, carried it like a stone inside him, heavier with every case that ended exactly as this one had. Too late for the dead, too costly for the living. I poured myself a drink and leaned back, letting the quiet settle. The brownstone was safe again. The rain had passed, but in the ledger Wolfe carried, the one no police report could amend, another line had been etched in permanent ink. And tomorrow, as always, would bring the next line, waiting to be written. Veronica returned to the brownstone 2 days after the arrests, bearing the weary dignity of someone who had faced down a storm and survived its lashing winds. She stood before Wolfe's desk, her hands folded tightly, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "I owe you more than I can ever repay," she said simply. "You honored her, Clarissa's truth, when others would have buried it alongside her." Wolfe inclined his head, a motion as formal as a bow from a medieval court. "Truth, Miss Lakewood, demands neither gratitude nor acknowledgement. It merely demands its due." Her smile was faint, but genuine. She glanced briefly at me, perhaps searching for a crack in Wolfe's imperious armor. I offered a wink small enough to pass unnoticed by Wolfe, but large enough to lift the corner of her mouth. "This isn't just thanks," she said, her voice firming. "It's a promise. Her story, and her fight, won't be forgotten." For a man who pretended disdain for sentiment, Wolfe let the silence linger longer than necessary. It wasn't discomfort, it was respect. The highest coin Nero Wolfe ever paid out without complaint. The debt Clarissa Dunn had left behind had been honored at last. Veronica's second offering was not words, but a gift. From behind her, she produced a shallow wooden box, its lid carved with careful, trembling artistry. She set it gently on Wolfe's desk, lifting the top to reveal a cluster of rare orchids, delicate, exotic, and impossibly vibrant even against the somberness of the afternoon. "Aunt Clarissa's favorite," she said softly. She said orchids endured where others withered. For a long moment, Wolfe simply gazed at them. His fingers hovered above the blossoms, tracing invisible lines in the air, a man measuring the pulse of something both fragile and defiant. "Miss Lakewood," he said at last, his voice unusually grave, "you have shown more understanding of tribute than most of your contemporaries show of duty." She flushed slightly, but said nothing more. I made a mental note to record the date. Wolfe accepting a gift without an argument, without a dismissive grunt, was rarer than snow in August. As Veronica closed the box again, Wolfe reached out with uncharacteristic gentleness, his hand resting briefly on the lid. It wasn't just a token, it was a seal, a promise that some victories, even quiet ones, would be remembered by the right men for the right reasons. After Veronica departed, the house settled back into the heavy, comfortable silence that always followed the end of a case. Wolfe returned to his chair, the orchids carefully placed on the side table nearest him. I leaned against the desk and folded my arms, studying him with open amusement. "I must say," I drawled, "watching you be noble is a rare enough event that I feel I ought to have it notarized." Wolfe closed his eyes and sighed, not out of weariness, but the monumental patience it took to tolerate my presence. "Archie," he said, without opening his eyes, "it is possible to act correctly without wallowing in sentiment." "Sure," I said, "and it's possible for a walrus to perform ballet, but it's not exactly an everyday occurrence." A corner of Wolfe's mouth twitched, barely, but enough. It wasn't victory he savoured, nor triumph. It was something quieter, something heavier, the knowledge that, for once, the right thing had been done without the corrosive stain of compromise. I let the banter drop after that, respecting the rare solemnity in the room. There were some jokes even I wasn't willing to push when Wolfe wore that particular look. Still, old habits die hard. The next morning, as Wolfe sat with his newspaper and his orchids, his trophies from a war fought without parades, I deposited a fresh invoice on his desk with a little more flair than necessary. He peered over the rim of his spectacles. "Archie, explain." I grinned. "New line item, emotional services rendered. 1 jar of orchids, accepted without protest, $500. For a heartbeat, I thought he might actually throw something at me. Instead, Wolfe made a sound somewhere between a grunt and a chuckle. An acknowledgement that while the day might have been won, the business of living remained as absurd as ever. "Bill Miss Lakewood's estate if you must," he said dryly, "but do not expect payment." I saluted. "Noted, sir. Worth every penny lost." There was a brief, flickering smile before he returned to his paper. It wasn't bitterness I saw lingering in Wolfe's eyes. It was weariness, the kind that comes when you realize some victories, no matter how complete, cost more than anyone should have to pay. Especially when once again, those who deserved peace were the ones left bearing the heaviest burden. By evening, the brownstone had sunk into a silence so profound it felt like the aftermath of a long-forgotten battle. The orchids sat quietly by Wolfe's chair, their petals a defiant splash of colour against the gathering dusk. Wolfe, untouched by the demands of dinner or conversation, simply sat and stared out the window, his mind wandering paths I could only guess at. Finally he spoke. Not to me exactly, but to the air, or perhaps to Clarissa Dunn herself. "Greed," he murmured, "is inexhaustible. Defeated once, it rises again elsewhere, wearing a different face." I said nothing. Sometimes the only service a man can render is silence. Wolfe shifted in his chair, an almost imperceptible gesture of exhaustion. Clarissa's sacrifice had exposed a rot that might heal, or might merely fester deeper beneath new, glossier surfaces. Wolfe knew it. So did I. Victory, if that was what we could call it, was measured not in celebrations, but in the heavy toll extracted from every soul that had touched the truth. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one, indifferent to the small, stubborn act of justice that had unfolded behind the brownstone's thick walls. Inside, Wolfe sighed, and the world turned on, unmoved. As the rain faded into silence outside the brownstone, Wolfe's gaze remained fixed on the orchids Veronica had left behind, a small, stubborn testament to Clarissa Dunn's sacrifice. In the end, he reflected, it was not the scale of the crime that weighed most heavily, but the silent choices that made it possible, the betrayals born not of greed alone, but of quiet, convenient indifference. What about you? In this case, do you believe the greater betrayal was fear or ambition, which in the end led more surely to ruin? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed stepping once more into the brilliant, brooding world of Nero Wolfe and Archie Goodwin, Don't forget to subscribe for more mysteries. And share this story with fellow lovers of classic detective fiction. Your support keeps these timeless investigations alive.